Hello, welcome back. So today we're going to start a very exciting section in the Gordon West Manual, and it's called Going Solo, your first amateur radio transmission. Oh boy, alright, so let's get started. But before we go into all the details, we first have to look at some terminology that you're going to need to know for the exam about making contacts. So let's look at the first piece of terminology. So you remember in my last lesson, we talked about how you have this little knob usually on your radio, or in the case that I presented, I have this knob on my handheld, and when I turn that knob, it causes the handheld to change frequency. So, a second. So I turn this knob, and I'm not sure if you can see on the screen, but as I turn the knob, the frequency changes. Now it turns out there's a very special name for this knob that changes the frequency. And this knob is actually called a VFO knob. So what is VFO? Well, like many things, VFO is an abbreviation, and it stands for something. VFO stands for the variable frequency oscillator. VFO knob is the frequency knob, but it stands for variable frequency oscillator. And the reason that's what it is because it varies the frequency, hence variable frequency. And then it's variable frequency oscillator because the knob, it does what we call, it oscillates too. But don't worry about that means just yet. We'll talk about oscillation perhaps in a later section. Anyway, all you need to know is that a VFO knob is the knob that changes the frequency on a ham radio. And if you're not using a handheld, but you're using a radio that sort of sits on the table, usually the knob will be in front here, and it'll be this big knob that you turn this way and that way to change the frequency. Okay, so now let's go back here to my handheld radio to learn about another important piece of terminology. And that terminology is called squelch. We're going to learn about the squelch control, which is on many of these radios. Okay, so what in the world is squelch? So the squelch control on the radio, squelch basically mutes the radio's volume when there's no signal coming into the receiver. So this way you don't hear static on the radio when there isn't a signal. Because after all, if you think about it, you really only need to be able to hear what's being received by the radio when there's actually a signal that you need to listen to, right? The rest of the time, if there's not a signal coming in, we often want the receiver to be silent. We want it to be silent, not make any noise when there's no signal that it's receiving. So you might not know this, but normal radios actually don't do this by themselves. Usually on a ham radio or on a radio without squelch control, if there is no signal being transmitted on the frequency, the radio isn't silent. It actually, static comes out of the speaker, not silence. We get static. So this is where the squelch control comes in. With the squelch control turned on, when there's no signal being received, the squelch control silences the receiver. It sort of turns off the volume. In other words, the squelch control, it squelches the receiver audio, which is why it's called the squelch. So the squelch turns off the receiver when there's no signal coming in so that we don't have to listen to static. And a note just for the test, this is called carrier squelch. The test might ask you questions about squelch, and it might give you a couple choices. It might ask you about, is this carrier squelch or is this tone squelch? We're not talking about tone squelch right now. We're talking about carrier squelch. And the reason it's called carrier squelch is a little, you don't really need to know that for the test, but basically just know radio signals have what we call a carrier that kind of carries the frequency along, and that's why it's called carrier squelch. Anyway, that's not important. All you really need to know for the exam is that this is carrier squelch and not tone squelch. Okay, so there's just one more final bit of terminology before we can move on to the good stuff. So in ham radio, you have, obviously you're transmitting and receiving, you're operating on a certain frequency, right? A certain frequency on the band. But it turns out sometimes your transmit frequency and your receive frequency, they don't actually have to be the same. Believe it or not, you do sometimes use separate transmit and receive frequencies on ham radio. You might transmit over here and you might receive over here on another frequency a little up on the band. So usually though, a lot of times the transmit frequency and the receive frequency, they are the same frequency. That is, you use the same frequency to both receive and transmit and receive, like a walkie-talkie. And that's probably what you think about when you think of operating on a frequency on ham radio. So this whole thing of transmitting on one frequency, using one frequency for the transmit frequency and one frequency on the receive frequency, that's sort of complicated, isn't it? The simplest and most obvious way to set your radio up is to have your transmit frequency the same as your receive frequency, right? That's simple. It's so simple, in fact, that we call it simplex. It's so simple we call it simplex. The receive frequency equals the transmit frequency. And that's how you can remember it. And I have that written up on the board here. You can take notes if you'd like. Okay, so now we're finally done with all the boring technical terms, and now we can actually get down to business, making your first radio transmission, or making your first contact, which is the name of this section. So you might be wondering, wow, where do you even start? like, how do you actually find people to talk to on ham radio? How do you let the world know that you're looking for someone to talk to you? Do you have to pre-schedule contacts beforehand? Or when you're on ham radio, how do you get people to actually have contacts with? So there's a there's an answer for this, and that's you call CQ. You do what you call CQ on ham radio. And let me explain what that means. So CQ basically means calling any station. And the letter CQ actually don't stand for anything. We just call it CQ for whatever reason. So what you do is you go on ham radio and you literally call, so if my call sign is KD2EOM, you literally go on some random frequency and you say CQ, 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 this is KD2EOM. And when the other ham operators hear that, and they hear the word CQ, 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 everybody knows that you're looking for someone to talk to. And so they, if they're available, they go ahead and they call you, and that's how you start conversations on ham radio. And that's called calling CQ. You call CQ, 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 this is your call sign, etc., etc. So before you call CQ, there are a few things you need to do. First of all, you need to make sure nobody else is using that frequency that you're going to call CQ on, because that'd be pretty bad if two people were already having a conversation and you just barge in and start calling CQ, 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 and then everyone gets mad. You don't want to do that. So you want to listen for a while to make sure nobody's using the frequency that you're going to call CQ on. And even after you listen for a while, you want to just ask really quick if the frequency is in use, just to make sure that you don't actually barge in on someone's conversation. You don't want to interfere with anyone else. So let me demonstrate for you with my handheld. So we're listening on this frequency. So as you can see, I don't hear anything. And if I wait for a while, I don't hear anything. So I think maybe the frequency is clear, but I can just ask just to make sure. This is KD2EOM is the frequency in use. And if no one answers, you can figure that no one's on the frequency, so it's clear. So then I can go ahead and call CQ. CQ, 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 this is KD2EOM, Kilo Delta 2 Echo Oscar Mike, calling CQ and standing by. And that's a typical call of CQ. And you'll notice no one's answered me right now. Sometimes you have to call CQ several times in order to get someone to talk to. But anyways, this is just for demonstration purposes, so now you know what calling CQ is like. Now, speaking of interfering, you really want to make sure that you're not barging in on someone else's conversation when you call CQ. What happens if you do find yourself on the same frequency as somebody else, and you're both transmitting at the same time, and you're sort of interfering with each other's signals because you're on the same frequency? What do? Well, when two stations are on the same frequency and they interfere with each other, nobody really has priority. It doesn't matter who was on the station, who was on the frequency first, or whose signal is stronger than the others. That doesn't all matter. Nobody has priority on that given frequency. The two hams just sort of have to work it out and use common courtesy in order to resolve the interference. One ham will probably move off to a different frequency. So another thing before calling CQ, you definitely want to make sure you're in your assigned band. Meaning you can't call CQ, obviously, outside of your operating privileges. Don't just pick some random frequency and start calling CQ there. Make sure you're allowed to transmit on that frequency. Check the band plan. Make sure you're allowed to transmit in that frequency. Make sure you're in your assigned band. So that's how we call CQ and find someone to talk to, but that's not the only way we can find someone to talk to on ham radio. We can also answer someone else who is calling CQ. So if someone else is over here, say, and they're calling CQ and you want to answer them, how exactly do you do that? And there's actually a question in the Gordon West manual that might show up on your test that asks directly about this. It asks, how should you respond to a station calling CQ? And there are four choices. A, transmit CQ followed by the other station's call sign. B, transmit your call sign followed by the other station's call sign. C, transmit the other station's call sign followed by your call sign. Or D, transmit a signal report followed by your call sign. And the answer is C. So when you're responding to a station calling CQ, what you do is you transmit the other station's call sign followed by your call sign. So for example, if one person's call sign is, say, KD2AMD and he's calling CQ, I might say KD2AMD, KD2EOM, or maybe KD2AMD, this is KD2EOM, or something like that. So that's what you do. Now, there's something else you need to know about when you're making your first contact, and this is whether you're calling CQ or not, just talking to other people in general. But radio waves can act sort of strange sometimes. And in fact, various services, maybe even around your house or your workplace or other buildings, some services actually reflect radio waves off of them. And some services actually absorb radio waves. You remember we were talking about how you can't use ham radio in your car very well because the metal absorbs all the radio waves. So some services reflect radio waves, some absorb them, and this creates very interesting factors when we're trying to talk to people on ham radio. So you might have noticed if you listen to FM radio in your car, you know how the FM radio in your car, sometimes you can't really receive the signal in certain spots as you're driving along the road. Like as you're driving along maybe a certain road, there are some spots on the road that are like dead spots. When you're in those certain sections of the road, you can't hear anything. And as soon as you drive through them, the FM station comes back again and you can continue listening to music in your car. You may have noticed that. Well, ham radio is sort of the same way. So standing over here, say, your signal might get to the other person loud and clear. And then suddenly you move over here, and all of a sudden the path that the radio wave takes to get to the other person sort of changes a little bit because you moved around. And maybe now it's not quite reflecting off a building the way it used to anymore, or something else is blocking it just because you moved that little bit, just not maybe a foot away. Anyway, the place where you stand, even within a few feet with your ham radio, that can actually make a big difference as to whether or not your signal can be heard by the other station. And there's a word for this in ham radio. This is called multipath distortion. And the Gordon West manual puts it very nicely. He says, Gordon West says, there are hot spots, that is, there are spots maybe in your house where the signal can get through to the other station just fine, okay. And then there are spots where the signal will not be able to get clearly to that same other station because it's in a different location and the radio wave path somehow gets distorted and doesn't get to the other person loud and clear. So at the end of the day, if someone says on ham radio that your signal suddenly went from being really strong to being really weak, one thing you can try to do is you can move a few feet, or if you have a directional antenna that is an antenna that transmits signals in one specific direction, not just everywhere, you can change the direction of that antenna. And that can help because then your signal will take a different path. And if you find the right path, you can eventually, hopefully, get your signal to be able to be received by the other station. Now, speaking of buildings, one thing the test expects you to know is that UHF signals, remember that's ultra high frequencies, UHF signals are better than VHF signals, or very high frequencies. UHF signals are better inside buildings. So if you're inside a building, you would be better off using UHF. And the reason for this is because that UHF signals, they have a higher frequency. And you'll remember the higher frequencies, they have shorter wavelength. And because UHF signals have that shorter wavelength, it allows them to penetrate through buildings much easier than VHF signals. So UHF signals are better inside buildings. And I want to make another note also about transmitting ham radio from cars, because you might be thinking about doing this. This is pretty common, actually. It's called mobile operation. We've already talked about how you shouldn't really use a handheld to transmit from your car because you won't be able to be heard very well. But there's another thing you should know about transmitting from your cars. There's a common phenomenon called picket fencing. So what's picket fencing? Well, so if you're in a car and you're talking to someone on ham radio, at the other end, the person who's not in the car, to the other person, it actually often literally sounds like the person in the car is driving along sort of next to a fence with all these posts, and the antenna is maybe sticking out and hitting all the fence posts as the car's driving along. In other words, as the person who's transmitting in the car, his signal sounds like he's hitting the fence post with something. You literally hear a sound as that person's driving in the car transmitting with their ham radio. It almost sounds like they're hitting a fence. That's why it's called the name picket fencing. That's why we call it that. So this is caused mainly due to roadway signs and guardrails, which actually, they mess up the strength of the signal, and they cause this picket fencing phenomenon where the other person hears this strange sound as the car is moving. So this is called picket fencing, and the test actually does expect you to know that. So now let's go to another aspect of talking to people on ham radio, and that's Q signals. So Q signals are very interesting. It's sort of almost like another language for ham radio. See, oftentimes we use what we call Q signals. Q signals are basically 3-letter abbreviations that start with the letter Q. They're used as abbreviations for common questions or statements that people make on ham radio. So if that's confusing, let me try to explain. So instead of saying to another person on ham radio, oh, there's interference on this frequency, there's interference, oftentimes we say there is QRM. And that QRM phrase there, that QRM word, that's the Q code. QRM actually means interference. QRM is short for interference. So that may not make much sense to you if you're talking on voice. I mean, QRM isn't really shorter than saying there's interference. But it actually helps a lot. These abbreviations help a lot, especially with modes like Morse code and such, when you have to transmit every letter. Instead of transmitting all the, 15 letters maybe of interference, you can just say, oh, QRM. So it's really helpful. And there are many Q codes that exist in ham radio, and your Gordon West manual has a list of them. But for the exam, you really just need to know 2 of them. For the first Q code you need to know is QRM. QRM means there's interference. And the second one is QSY. And QSY means you're changing frequency. Now, there isn't really a good way to memorize these, short of just plain up memorizing them. So just write these cue codes down in your notebook and try to remember them for the exam. So we're almost getting to the end of the section, but we have a few things to cover. One of the things, the test might ask you questions about something that we call contesting. Okay, so what is contesting? Well, in ham radio, you have what we call contests. And oftentimes, hams have contests where they try to contact as many stations as they can, as many stations as possible in a limited period of time, say 24 hours or 36 hours. And it's really a lot of fun. So you have this contest to see who can contact the most people. And that's what a ham radio contest is. Now, a note here, when you're contesting, if you're participating in a contest, you should only send the minimum required information to make the contact for the contest. So you need to be as fast as possible because, after all, it is a contest. You're trying to make as many contacts as possible in a certain amount of time. So there's no time for chit-chat. You just send the minimum information and move on as quickly as possible when you're in a contest. And believe it or not, the test actually does expect you to know that. Anyway, there's one last thing you should know about, and then we're done for the day. And that one last thing is called a grid locator. So what exactly is a grid locator? Well, hams wanted to be able to exchange information about their location. For example, I can tell you my location is in New York, but oftentimes on ham radio, people want to be more specific than that. But the problem is, if I say I'm in Warwick, New York, I can tell people I'm in Warwick, New York, but nobody knows where Warwick, New York is. So that doesn't really help. So what we did is we've created this system called grid locators. And a grid locator, a grid locator is a letter and number designator that describes your location. So anyway, that's the official term. But in other words, in plain English, a grid locator is a unique set of letters and numbers, and it's unique to your specific location. And they have grid locator maps, and I'll let you read more about grid locators in the Gordon West manual because we're sort of running out of time. But if you look into grid locators, it's actually very easy to tell based on a grid locator and the map exactly where the location is of the person that you're talking to on ham radio. So whenever people hear your grid locator, my grid locator, for example, is FN21, they'll know exactly where you are. You can actually find the section FN on the map and then the number 21 in there, and they'll know exactly where I am on ham radio, or almost exactly. So it's a lot easier than just saying my town and state. Excuse me. Okay. The Gordon West manual has more details about grid locators, so I'll let you read more about them in there. So in fact, we're almost done. Actually, we are done now. That was the last thing we were going to cover in this section.